This video was made in association with KnifeInformer.com. Head on over to Knife Informer for all of your blade-related needs, including reviews, comparisons, stats, and more. What is up, everybody, and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this Wyk Sodbuster. This is Martinus Van Wyk's 13th knife that he produced. Now, some of you may be familiar with this knife as it has appeared in a Nick Shabazz video in the past. So definitely feel free to go check that out if you're looking for certain objective things that I don't necessarily always cover on this channel. And I also want to point out that because it's only number 13 of the knives that at least he's produced under this moniker, take it for what it is, right? As we've seen with some other sort of part-time South African makers that we've showcased on the channel, there's lots of improvements always being made. So do bear in mind that this knife is super early in production for him. I mean, it's a custom, so don't get that twisted. But, this is very early on for him, and so bear that in mind moving forward. Now, we are going to go ahead and jump into some of the statistics. First up is going to be the overall length. So I'll give you guys a good idea of what that is. Okay, here we go. Get this lined up, and we're looking at just shy of 8.5 inches there, maybe sort of just a 1/16 of an inch shy of 8.5 inches. So fairly reasonable size knife. Let's go ahead and see that compared to a couple of common knives. We'll check out the Paramilitary 2, which you can see is very comparable in terms of size. And then we'll bring out the Rat 2 as well. Okay, let's get these lined up here. Sometimes I struggle with the Rat because it has the little lanyard here. There we go, we should be good. So you can see PM2 just shy in terms of length if you take the very far end of the PM2 butt versus the very far end of the Van Wyk butt. I'm just kind of, sometimes it's difficult to see from the perspective that I'm sitting at, but so yeah, you can see Van Wyk is going to be a little bit longer than the PM2. Ultimately, it's going to share a lot of similar other dimensions. It's very similar in thickness. We'll get the Rat 2 out of the way here. It's not quite as relevant now that you guys have seen that. So if we take a look at the thickness, very comparable to the thickness of a PM2. We do have the contoured edges on the Sodbuster, and it might actually be Sodbuster. I am reading this off of his handwritten card, which I'll show you guys here. That could be a U or an A pretty easily, so I'm going to say Sodbuster, as that's what it looks like to me, but do know that I might be pronouncing that incorrectly. So we do have the contoured handles here versus the flat handles on the PM2, but do check out this relatively even size comparison, or thickness comparison rather. So overall, pretty similar in size in terms of sort of the way that it's going to operate on a daily basis. You can see the PM2 has some more shaping done to the handle and everything. You also have the opportunity to choke up on this choil here, which you do not have with the non-finger choil, sharpening choil that you have on the Van Wyk. So, there's a little bit to consider there, but ultimately going to be very similar in size. So let's go ahead and get the PM2 out of the way and check out the weight of the Van Wyk, because it's a little bit hefty with those full titanium frame. Okie doke, let's go ahead and check out the weight. Now we have no internal milling on this knife, and we do have a steel backspacer. So ultimately, even though it's not too thick of a knife, and at 8.5 inches, it's certainly not on the small side, but it's also not gargantuan. At what did that say? 5.5 ounces? 5.29 ounces or so. It's a little bit on the heavier side. If you're looking for that sort of everyday carry that you really want to sort of be unnoticeable in your pocket, this may not be the choice for you. It's a pretty solid build here, with the solid construction frame, no internal milling, the solid steel backspacer, which you can see goes all along the length of the knife, in addition to the blade, where the blade stock's not incredibly thick, but it is there. So that's definitely something to consider. This knife has a lot of structure to it, and the way that it feels is very solid, kind of like a rock, but whether or not that sort of matters to you is kind of up to you. So let's get the scale out of the way and go ahead and jump into the features and flaws. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started by looking at sort of just the materials, general showcase of the knife. So right off the bat, you can see the frame is full construction of titanium. It's a 6AL 4V titanium, and then it's got a bead blasted finish. Nothing too incredibly special to see there, but you know, I really like bead blasted finishes on titanium, especially when you're doing that sort of plain tie knife styling. This was something that I really liked on that Norseman that I had a while back. I have particularly slippy hands, rather. I live in kind of a humid area, so when a smooth handle has some otherwise, you know, some grip otherwise provided by texturing, that can be very beneficial. See, we have this full steel backstrap now. The blade, we'll get into this later, but the blade is N690, and I'm pretty sure the backspacer is going to be N690 as well. The steel backspacers that I've had from other part-time makers in South Africa, most notably Francois Masson and Herukis Blumeris, I've had I've had steel backspacers on knives from both of them, and both of those knives had N690 blade steel, and it was N690 in the backspacer, so I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption that this is N690 in the backspacer here. Alright, so the next thing that I want to point out to you guys is this internal jeweling. Get a load of this, and as I've said in many other videos, oh, I'm not giving you guys a very good visual here, am I? Turn this down. Oh, it is down. There you go. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos, you know, doing a little bit to the internals goes a long way with me. I'm definitely really appreciative of the jeweling on the inside of this knife. And, you know, when the knife is otherwise completely plain, if you guys can hear a dog in the background, we have a foster dog right now, and he's not super happy, so I apologize about that if you hear any squeaking or whining. But yeah, the internals, they go a really long way with me, and on a knife that's otherwise completely plain like this one, you know, it's really nice to have a little bit of styling and a little bit of fanciness sort of going on the inside, where the exterior of the knife is a lot more conducive to, you know, hard work. So that pretty much does it for the materials in the showcase. We'll, of course, go over the blade later in its own section. Let's go ahead and jump into the ergonomics. Now, the ergonomics on this knife, pretty simple. It is a sort of larger pill shape. You have a nice large handle that provides plenty of room. So you can see here, plenty of room on either side of my fingers. And therefore a much larger hand would be perfectly equally served with this knife. Now, that's going to cover the saber grip, but in terms of pinch grip, it's pretty self-explanatory. Again, it's just a general kind of style of blade, but you can see here, if I am pinching, my middle finger is kind of right up in this area that's relieved from the lock bar, because the lock bar actually goes in pretty far. You can see lockup on this knife is maybe about 60%. And the lock bar is pretty thick, so it gets in there. And so when you are pinch gripping, there's a little bit of loss of grip in this area, just because your middle finger, the meat of it, starts to slip off of this ridge onto this one. And so it's just not super, but you can just kind of see as I grip harder, my middle finger kind of like naturally slides forward, and that's just because of the angle that it's sliding off on this super deep lock bar cutout. So not the worst thing in the world, but definitely something to note when you are pinch gripping the knife. And then on the blade spine here, it's really slippery. You can see we have a nice clean satin finish. It looks great, but with that pinch grip, again, your index finger is kind of free to slip around. So, you know, it's going to be perfectly fine. You don't have to bear down that hard to cut through something like an apple or whatnot. It's got a plenty fine sort of general shape for pinch grip slicing and everything like that. It's going to be fine, but it's just a little bit slippery of a knife. Now, I do imagine if you had gloves on, this knife would be a dream, because the bead blasted handle is going to grip the glove very well, and then also you don't just get quite as slippery on all these super polished finishes. But again, I by no means am trying to say that this knife is inefficient as a tool. It's not, but it is a little bit, does provide a little bit less purchase than maybe some other knives. So let's go ahead and jump on to the clip. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of pressed clips like this. You can see it's pretty basic, pretty thin cut out titanium, and then sort of pressed into shape. This one in particular doesn't have a ton of space under it. And kind of has a shallow ramp, so it's definitely two hands in the pocket for sure. And the blasted finish isn't the best either for, you know, being completely kind to your pants and also being able to slip in and out very well. That said, overall, it's very functional. It just could be improved upon. You know, I would like to see a 3D milled clip on this knife, or really any knife. You can see the theme here in some of the South African customs that I have. They are all the versions with the 3D milled clips versus some other versions that have come out with pressed clips in the past. So definitely something I could see being updated. A perfectly reasonable clip on such an early knife. But I do like the fact that it kind of really fades away, right? Like, I don't feel this in my hand at all. You almost don't even see it on the knife. It blends in so very well. So that's great. It's a functional clip, but more could be done there for sure. Now, moving on to the action, of course, we're breaking this down into two sections. First is deployment, and the second is the closing. The deployment on this knife, the first thing in my notes just says, wow. It's got a absolutely ridiculous deployment. First of all, let's talk about this flipper tab. So you can see here, it's kind of a pretty basic shape, right? We've got a little bit of a curve here, a little bit of a curve here, some nice sharp jimping all along the edge. And what this means is, I mean, let me start by saying the knife has a particularly strong detent. So just a basic light switch, knife absolutely soars out. And if you want to do full-on push button and really get the most out of the sort of shape of the flipper tab, you can push and you get deployment that is insane. Absolutely insane. This knife rockets out no matter how you utilize the flipper tab. It's not as conducive to the light switch method, just because this sort of point here that it comes to is like digging right into your index finger, but I don't really feel it. It doesn't feel like it's ripping at my finger. It doesn't feel sharp. There are definitely some other tabs that I've used where the same sort of problem can result in sharpness or hot, like a hot spot, and that's not really happening here that much. I just noticed that the flipper tab wasn't exactly shaped in a way that might adhere naturally to the light switch method. But either way, you can see after a couple deployments now, the knife fires like an absolute champ. So one thing that needs to be said about this deployment that really sets it apart from others is the acoustics. Now, this knife is definitely the loudest knife I've ever heard deploy ever. Now, I have some Thorburns laying around. You know, I tried an A3 that a buddy had that I have a video on of the channel. That was extraordinarily loud. This L36 is very, very loud. Do that right up next to the mic. And so let's hear this Thorburn thwack up against the Van Wyk. Now, I don't know if that difference came across on the mic, but it came across in real life. This knife can hurt your ears sometimes if you get it just right and you're in a small room like I usually am. This knife takes that to the next level. There have been multiple times where I flipped this and winced at the pain that I felt in my ears. It is so freaking loud. So if acoustics are something that you really enjoy on a knife and is something that's a big part of your custom buying experience, this is a perfectly reasonable newer maker to look into. Now, I'm told by the owner of this knife, which, by the way, I forgot to mention earlier in the video, big thanks to Mike for sending this knife along, among many others that you have all seen videos on thus far. I'm told that this knife, the acoustics on it and everything, were developed with the mentorship of Andre Thorburn, which makes a lot of sense. So clearly, I don't know if it's Martinus or Martinus. His name has an H in it. But clearly, he has spent some time with Thorburn and really gotten this sound down. I mean, it's just wicked, the sound this thing makes. Absolutely wicked. Now, I have to say, as we move on to the closing, you know, the lock bar strength on this knife is outrageous, and there's no falling shut with this thing at all. I mean, you can see that was maybe 8 or 10 shakes to get it to close. Light shakes, albeit, you know, I'm not, if I can whip it just like you can whip any knife. But God, it's so loud. But you can see very light shakes, which might normally coax something like a Thorburn or a Bloomeris into the closed position. Doesn't quite do the same with this Van Wyk here. Now, as I mentioned before, I hadn't really talked about the lock bar up to this point, but it's incredibly strong, and the sort of area that this sort of area here is not super great. It's not super conducive to disengaging the lock bar. You can see he's done some cutting away here, some sort of chamfering, which is great, except it's on the wrong side. I guess the idea here was that it would let you slip your finger in some so you could disengage the bar, but really this should be on the lock bar side itself so that I can get more purchase, because what happened here was, even with this cutaway, you can see with the 60% or so lockup, this lock bar really doesn't leave much room in this gap. And so what ends up happening is I'm basically just using this little bit of fat on the tip of my thumb, and that's kind of getting pushed in. I don't think I can show this, but my thumb is not in the area at all, as you can see. And this is how I have to disengage the knife. I just have to basically use the meat of my thumb to really get in there and just use that to leverage the lock bar out of the way. So not a whole lot of room to get in here, and then because the lock bar is so strong, it just becomes kind of a pain to disengage. So this is not my favorite knife to sit and fidget with, just because the disengagement is so difficult, and it is that incredibly strong lock bar that is going to cause the lack of the dropping shut on the knife, because I must say it is incredibly smooth. If we do sort of disengage the lock bar, you can see it is free. So nice and smooth, but this lock bar is going to be kind of shutting that down in terms of the closing action. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the blade. The blade steel that we have here, as I mentioned before, is N690, and it has a hardness of 60 RC. And we are looking at, of course, a hand rub satin finish, the kind of signature choice of South African custom makers. Let's take a quick look at that. We do have the mirror finish right up here on the flats, which you can see goes into the flat, kind of carries all the way to the tip here. Oh, a little bit off frame, sorry about that. I really like it when makers taper a super thin flat. This was something that we saw on that JD Van Deventer pinstripe that we had. I really like it when it just kind of is very elongated and comes to a very thin point. It's just, it's not easy to pull that off, with the kind of... with a kind of cleanliness and accuracy. These are hand ground, these blades, and that's very difficult. So I definitely appreciate the way he's kind of incorporated the flats here. It's a little bit Gareth Bull-esque, just in terms of how much of the actual blade face is being utilized by the grind. We are looking at a hollow grind as well throughout this blade. And ultimately, I don't think I have to say much about the shape. You guys know this thing is going to be a mad slicer. We have a pretty reasonable blade stock for a knife of this size. Nothing too crazy. Let's compare that real quick to the L36. You can see the L36 at its thickest is even thicker than the Van Wyk, and this knife is an excellent slicer, as I've learned from many, many months of experience. You can see the Thorburn does taper a little bit more towards the front, while this carries its thickness all the way to the tip, just about anyway, up to this point. And so, yeah, completely reasonable as a slicer, completely reasonable as a blade. Very just useful shaped knife overall. Very simple. Keep it simple, stupid. Anytime I see sort of a newer maker, I definitely appreciate seeing knife number 13 look like this than seeing knife number 13, covered in Damasteel and all these crazy materials and this and that, because I really think that sets you back as a maker, because you end up having to charge really high prices for a knife that ultimately doesn't really earn those prices in terms of mechanical prowess. This was unfortunately something I saw happen with... well, actually, I don't want to bring up other makers or really get into that right now. Maybe I'll make another video on that. If you guys want me to talk a little bit about newer makers and their sort of methods and attitudes towards jumping into the business. We could talk about Keith Kruger, we could talk about Van Wyk, we could talk about Alan Kritzman, we could talk about a bunch of people that I sort of have on my mind. So let me know down in the comments below if you'd like to see that video. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go as far as this Van Wyk is concerned. Again, I really just want to point out that this wasn't... the fairest review, just in the sense that it's an older knife. We are looking at exactly 1 year from the day I'm filming this is when the knife was made. So it's older, it's number 13. He's got a whole another year under his belt making knives, and so I definitely look forward to getting another Van Wyk on the table so that hopefully we can see how his improvements have been. Maybe we've cut down on that lock bar tension a little bit. Maybe we've focused a little bit more on this flipper tab shape, even though, again, it's perfectly functional. Don't let me talk you out of it being a good flipper tab, because it is. But yeah, I'd really like to see the improvements moving forward. Big thanks to Mike for sending this along. Of course, if you guys would like to see beautiful pictures of this knife or any of these other knives on the table, you can do so by following me on Instagram at tovarishworks. If you'd like to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, you can do so by emailing me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. And if you guys appreciated this video, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much, and I will see you next time.